Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed those first two segments and they have you covered for tomorrow night's big game in the AFC North. But now we transition to our positional rankings, getting to the end of them here. But we start off with our tight ends. This is the position that a lot of people say is the X factor or the bane of their existence in fantasy this season, because some of them have performed above expectations, some below. And this list accounts for that kind of discrepancy. There's a lot of high-end tight ends here to account for. Then I wanted to include some guys who, I want to see get going and have matchups that I feel are favorable to them. So, without further ado, let's jump into our tight end positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL season. Starting off with a young man who is on the bye this week, playing in a very interesting game, perhaps the game of the week, at least from an intra-conference perspective. Pat Freiermuth going up against the Commanders coming off the bye are the Steelers, and it just feels like there's a new sense of reinvigoration within the Pittsburgh Steelers receiving corps, even though they traded for Mike Williams, and he's going to be a very interesting piece to how this AFC North race plays out. Pat Freiermuth is someone who I can't ignore in terms of how he can play into Russell Wilson's strengths, because they're still going to be a heavy play-action team. They're really going to stretch the field vertically, play to Russ's strengths. And what I love about what Russ can bring, even with this kind of rejuvenation of the receiving corps and the addition of a guy like Williams, is the fact that in play action, he's always going to play it safe initially before looking for the deeper threats down the field. And so that's why Pat Freiermuth's effectiveness is really going to come to light, because either the Steelers are going to become one of those teams who is going to stretch the field vertically, really scare you in that manner with Pickens and Williams as that deep threat tandem. But Pat Freiermuth is so savvy that you can still include the aspects of the Steelers that I really like about them. And I think that can really help them succeed in important games on the stretch. And so in this one, even though it's not yet a divisional game, that will come in 2 weeks' time when they face the Ravens, it's still a game of hefty importance to them, because the Commanders are making a lot of noise, and the Steelers kind of feel like they're not getting enough praise for what they've been doing. And so this is kind of the game where we'll see if the Steelers can kind of shift the hype a little bit, can kind of say, well, we can't be ignored. If the Commanders are being lauded in this way, then we should have the respect as well. And Pat Freiermuth can be the X factor in that, because as long as the Steelers have two guys who can get on the field, can put up points for you, you still need your guy who can unlock defenses when the going gets rough, like Pat Freiermuth, to really shine for you. And he will in this one against the Commanders, in my humble opinion. Then let's look at a guy who status is up in the air for him, but I still feel that if he plays, has a lot of value for this team. Dallas Goedert versus the Cowboys. And it's looking a little bit ominous for the outlook of Dallas Goedert. And it's going to hurt a lot of fantasy football managers if he doesn't play, because he's been a shining star at the tight end position in these past couple of weeks. Someone who has really balanced this Philly offense really well, making them dangerous despite the worries there with the offensive play calling. And so, if he does not play in this game, that is huge, because I feel like that will be one of those suffering points for the tight end position to look at and say, damn, Dallas Goedert could really bolster the case for me to consider more tight ends like him. if he does play, then I feel like this matchup is a no-brainer. And I feel like more tight ends like Dallas Goedert will find themselves being respected more in deeper leagues. And so his health is paramount to how I feel about him headed into this week, and it should be with you as well. But his status could really define how we view that middle tier of tight ends. If we feel that they can't be relied upon, whether it be because of injuries, offensive struggles, things of that nature, then I feel like we're not going to place much emphasis on a position that's slowly kind of losing its charm here in the fantasy world. But if a guy like Dallas Goedert can really kind of step up, then there's hope for the tight end position to really expand its base to a much broader scale. Because right now, I kind of feel like we're stuck between the elite and the average at best. And so that's what Dallas Goedert might have to bridge this week. That divide between our standards and what we should be expecting from certain tight ends week in, week out. And another guy who I kind of wanted to address in a similar vein is Kyle Pitts going up against the Saints. He played Dallas this past weekend and had perhaps the most abysmal performance of the season, only 2.1 fantasy points to show in that game. And so, looking at that from that perspective, I kind of feel like the two guys who I've just mentioned, Goddard and Pitts, kind of represent the initial kind of thinking we get from the tight end position this season. Kyle Pitts is someone who projects as a lower first round to mid second round kind of pick in fantasy drafts, in my humble opinion. In other leagues, to deeper leagues, he may go a little bit later, and that wouldn't necessarily surprise me if he did. But he's still someone who is so highly regarded at the position that people are still willing to take flyers on. Whereas I'm trying to bring to mind a player like Dallas Goedert, who deserves just as much credit in an offense that is actually, compared to what the Falcons are doing a little bit, overachieving. When I look at the Eagles compared to the Falcons, there are more questions, in my opinion, surrounding the Eagles. But if you look at the Falcons, they really haven't done a great job in really getting the best out of guys like Pitts in this team. And they've suffered for it, whereas the Eagles, they're more suffering in certain situations because of the ineptitudes of Nick Sirianni as a play caller. And so, in that kind of tier here, that I'm expanding to include a guy like Dallas Goedert, would you rather rely upon a guy like Kyle Pitts over Dallas Goedert in a similar game? In fact, a game in which both teams will play against the Dallas Cowboys after this week, and say that, well, Kyle Pitts felt like the better pick for me because, he's the better tight end. It doesn't necessarily work that way sometimes. But in this matchup, I'm not trying to indict Kyle Pitts because he's still, at the end of the day, a very, very solid tight end. And against the Saints, he's going to prove it, because the Saints, this one was much more matchup oriented. Against the Cowboys, it was kind of up in the air because, these were two teams coming in with kind of similar situations. The Falcons felt a little bit further ahead. And then obviously, with the injury to Dak Prescott in the middle of that game, it was very clear that the Atlanta Falcons were going to win. This week, I feel it's even more clear because the Saints just feel like they're in free fall right now. and just feels so safe to pick someone going up against them, in this matchup. So, as much as Kyle Pitts has had his pratfalls this season, in certain matchups, he's still someone who figures prominently. And then the last guy I want to talk about is a guy who is kind of in a weird place right now because he was seen as perhaps the cream of the crop at the tight end position. Perhaps the tight end one in most leagues. And not for nothing, but he is in an offense that prides itself on its diversity and versatility. So we don't necessarily know how Sam Laporta is positively or negatively affecting fantasy football as a whole, and most importantly, the tight end position. Last week, he only had 4.8 fantasy points against a divisional opponent in the Green Bay Packers, and that could be worrying to some people. But he's still an elite tight end, like I said. And I don't necessarily feel like the Lions will always predicate themselves on being an either-or team. They're going to have to, at some point stick to one game plan because the playoffs are a different animal and certain games are a different animal. And this week against the Texans, I kind of feel like more pressure's on them than Houston, even though Houston has a lot of deficiencies to cover for, a lot of injuries to account for as well there. And so Sam Laporta is someone who I really appreciate at the tight end position, no matter how horrible or stupendous he has been this season. And in this game, I feel he's going to prove his value in more ways than one. Even if he's not, targeted as much as you like, he's still an important factor for Detroit Lions, and that is why he rounds out my weekly tight end positional rankings. But coming after this short break, let me know what you think in the comments about this one. We will have our final positional rankings with our defense and special teams units to monitor for Week 10. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back.